This is a super good book. I'll read some of it. In the close confines of the urban jungle, they're not hard to find. Some of them are more forward than others, not really caring if you see them or not. But most try to stay hidden, people hurriedly making their way down the city streets, pretend they're not there, treating them like some family ghost, which if they ignore long enough will quietly go away. But these people are no ghosts. They may be people who are haunted by the incessant and gnawing bite of addiction, but they're not ghosts. They may be people who are trapped in a nightmare of mental or emotional abnormality, but they're not a part, whatever that word is. They may be people through a series of life-altering catastrophes, have seen their world come crumbling down around them, but they're not phantoms. No, they're very much flesh and bone. Those yellow, bloodshot eyes are not that much different from yours. In the right conditions of summer heat or winter chill, the skin that covers your hand would look just as dry and leathery as theirs. Jerry was one of those back alley homeless and nameless people that shop owners and townsfolk wish would vanish into thin air. He was a misfit, a thief, an all-around menace to society. One might think that 7 years in the state penitentiary and a good dose of jailhouse religion would have gone a long way in changing Jerry. But it didn't. Once a free man, he hit the streets again, this time plunging in deeper and deeper into wickedness, thinking that somehow he had outstretched the bounds of the love of God. But at last, God was there with an extended hand of love each time he fell, until one day it was he that God was using as his extended hand of love and compassion to the fallen, a helping hand that reached out to thousands languishing on the streets of New York City with a hot meal, a clean bed, and life-changing message of Jesus Christ. And it was he who sparked movement for the last 140 years, who has impacted the lives of millions of people. Jerry McAuley was, I think that's his name, McAuley, was born in Ireland, 1839. From the moment of his birth, it seemed the deck was stacked against him. His family disintegrated not long after he entered this world. His father was a criminal, a counterfeiter by trade, and had forsaken his family to run from the law. Not much is known of his mother. Either she could not or would not care for this child and gave him over to his grandmother. This woman was little more than a guardian on paper. Young Jerry was never sent to school, never taught to read. He was allowed to practically come and go as he pleased, which led to constant run-ins with the authorities. On top of this, no matter into whose hands he was entrusted, he suffered abuse and harsh treatment. Finally, at the age of 13, in exasperation, Jerry's grandmother sent him to the United States to live with his sister in New York City. Although he started out with legitimate employment working for his brother-in-law, he quickly began to stoop down to a life of dishonesty and theft. Before long, Jerry was out of his sister's home and living by his wits on the street. He would work for what he could and then steal the rest. After a long while, he came into the possession of a boat that he would use to steal cargo from docked ships in the New York harbor until the cloak of darkness. Under the cloak of darkness, he and a few cohorts would wade into the waters by night, thieving all that they could, then by day sell their goods, and then paint the town red. He became a notorious nuisance to the 4th Ward in Lower Manhattan. Although what Jerry McAuley had in fact done as a river thief was enough to send him to prison 100 times over, the charges that caught up to him were, by his own account, entirely not his doing. He was charged with highway robbery. Local merchants and store owners saw a chance to rid themselves of the young man, so they pointed the finger at Jerry for the crime. Without much of a legal defense, McAuley was sentenced to 15 years hard labor in the state prison known as Sing Sing. Even though untaught to read, he had picked up some sound and letters along the way, enough to be able to read the haunting words above the entrance to the prison. The way of transgressors is hard. Proverbs 13:15. This was a phrase that was often repeated and familiar to those who made a life of sin and lawlessness, even though it is a verse from the Bible. To Jerry, the path his life had taken him was hard. He wanted to die. 15 years in the infamous Sing Sing prison for a crime he didn't commit. Sure, he had done a lot that merited a stiff penalty, but to know that he was in prison doing time for someone who walked away scot-free, the thought of something happily walking at liberty while he suffered for their wrong threw him into a rage and then sank him into depression. At length he thought it best not to fight against the prison environment, but to attempt to follow its rules in hopes that by some means his sentence might be cut short. But this was not easy to do in the 19th century Sing Sing. The prisons were held to a strict silent system. Prisoners ate in silence. They worked in silence. They existed in a world of unbroken hush. When that silence was violated, there were harsh consequences. There were water tortures, where water was allowed to drip on an inmate's head from a high distance for hours at a time. Others included solitary confinement, flogging with whips, and bucking, which was hanging a man upside down for long periods of time. Each time Jerry slipped up, each time he was punished, it only made him harder and harder. And after 5 years at Sing Sing, Jerry was miserable. He had poured himself into learning to read and write with some measure of success. But what he fed his mind upon only fueled a murderous hatred for the ones who landed him in jail. One particular Sunday, he chose to go with the majority of men to the chapel service rather than languish with despair in his cell. As he entered the room, his eyes were fixed upon a familiar face on the platform in his former days. Running the streets, Jerry did some prize fighting. Orville Gardner was a fighter, a gambler, and an all-around thug, known as Awful Gardner. He was a brutal boxer, touted as one of the best fighting men in New York. He was favored to defeat Dominic Bradley for the heavyweight championship of America. But after serving stint in Sing Sing himself, Gardner was converted in 1857, New York City, in the revival. One might see him as America's first celebrity convert to Christianity. He became a powerful preacher. When Jerry McCauley saw him that day, he remembered him as a calloused criminal. You can imagine the shock that came upon Jerry when Gardner began to speak. Gardner said that he was uncomfortable standing behind the pulpit, thinking him unworthy to speak from such a place. He came down to the floor level among the men, and there gave a tear-filled testimony of how he had been where they were sitting only a few years ago. He told them of the life-changing power of Jesus Christ and how God had worked in his life. It wasn't long before he knelt down and through his sobs asked God to do a work in the hearts of the men in that room. There was not a dry eye in the place. Jerry was doing everything that he could to hold back the tears for fear of what others might think. Jerry knew Orville. He knew that God had worked a genuine miracle in this man's life.